There's Malia. Hi, Malia.
So if this were Dave's dissertation defense, he wouldn't pass.
I don't very use PowerPoint, so but it's not up there.
Unfortunate. Here, hang on. I know.
Yeah, luckily I passed that a while ago.
Yeah. Look at all those Zoom folks.
Quinn.
Good to see y'all.
We're here.
Oh, there it is.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Jack, for that quick introduction, and thanks for all your patience. So, it's a super huge honor to be back here and introducing Dan for his dissertation defense. It has been an awesome journey with him. I'll start out by saying that I want thank you to Lucas and Ty, who, if they're both online, they both sent me really awesome pictures of Dan. Part of the reason I don't have pictures of Dan is because Dan does everything alone. He's off in the wilds all by himself, as you'll see. But I wanted to start by showing some pictures of Dan in his natural habitat, which is actually, when I put this into PowerPoint, the alternate text came up as person alone in field of snow. That's about it, right? So here's Dan in his natural habitat. Dan first contacted me, actually, he loves to remind me of this, in 2014, saying that, hey, I just finished my undergrad a few years ago. I've been working in natural resource management and fire management specifically, and one of my friends, Aaron, actually told me about you, and I'd be interested in talking about pursuing graduate school with you. And what Dan likes to remind me is that I didn't email him back. And people who email me all the time know that this is a bad trait of mine. But he was persistent, and that is another thing that you will learn about Dan, if you don't know that already, is that he has both patience and persistence to get through these sorts of things. So he emailed me again in 2017, 3 years later, and that time, thankfully, I replied to him, and we started communicating about grad school. And specifically, Dan worked a lot in the Pacific Northwest rainforest systems, which you're going to hear a bit about today, and really impressed me right off the bat with his incredible knowledge of this ecosystem, and very nuanced knowledge, and actually better than anybody else in the world. And that's something to be said, especially for people that have been here and botanists here that have worked in this system for many, many years. Dan knew more than these people, and that was really impressive. So thankfully I did bring Dan, we brought Dan on, and Dan used that knowledge to sample throughout the Pacific Northwest, as you'll see, and in the US and in Canada, more broadly than anybody had sampled before. And it was really through a lot of that persistence, going out alone, writing grants, getting funding to go out and do all of this work, and also had the opportunity to train some undergrads during that process. Quinn is online, I saw, was one of those that got to spend a summer with Dan out in the wilds. And so here's Dan collecting, and I think California is one of those, and the other shots up on Freeze Out Ridge, actually, just here. He also was really good getting through problems, right? And this is a problem that he's had this car for way too long. And so there were many of these type of incidents of changing tires and or calling tow trucks and getting through. But Dan, the point of this slide is that he worked through these issues. He worked through these problems and was able to persevere. He also had problems with his own locomotion, where he was really resilient beyond what most people would do. And so this is a picture that some pictures Lucas shared with me of Dan's feet and surviving and continuing on throughout that work. Dan is also an excellent educator and communicator. This is Dan and Lucas, actually. Dan, after I left here, recognized there was a gap in field botany training and created a class, a field botany and field ecology course that he taught on out of our campus here. And this is him out with a group of students. That was one of the things I think that impresses me the most, is that when I left Idaho, Dan decided to stay. I can't say that I was not disappointed. I was super disappointed, but not disappointed in Dan. I was disappointed because I didn't get to bring him with me. What he did was fill a lot of those gaps here, teaching gaps. He also took that opportunity to become a herbarium scientist. And that's something that I don't know if he expected to become such an important part of his future career, I hope. And so he's actually applied for several jobs that have looked in herbarium sciences, and that is something that I'm very proud of, that he sort of embraced that and has moved, and that will become part of his long-term career. Dan is an adventurer. That's something you'll see throughout his talk as well. And here he is on the top of Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Mount Hood, and Mount Shasta. I think Rainier should be in here at some point.
Finale.
The finale of the Northwest. So Dan is quite the adventurer. And hopefully he feels like this at the end of today. And not like this. Okay, back to Dan and his natural habitat. I'm really excited to hear about his talk today. I think you guys will enjoy this. And without further ado, let's welcome Dan. Let's see if we can successfully switch that over.
It's going.
Sweet, we good?
All right. Okay, well, welcome. So I'm going to be giving you guys my dissertation defense, and Dave and Jack mentioned I've been thinking about these questions for quite some time. It actually goes back all the way to my undergrad when I started just hiking through temperate rainforest areas or areas with temperate rainforest plants scattered throughout Montana and Idaho. Sometimes these plant populations would be large, contiguous populations. Other times they'd be isolated little clumps of trees or populations isolated in drainages in Montana. And simultaneously doing that, I also started fighting forest fires in the Clearwater National Forest, which is the southern edge of the temperate rainforest here in Idaho. And along with formulating some of my ideas about biogeography, which is the overarching concept of my dissertation, I started thinking about fire adaptations in conifers. Like, when do these things evolve? How broadly distributed are they on the conifer phylogeny? And yeah, I cold called Dave in 2017 and said, hey, what are you doing? What do you think about all this? And they were, both Dave and Jack are in the middle of this grant and brought me on. So my dissertation has two main parts. One is the temperate rainforest phylogeographic history. The other is fire, and both of these are tied together in that we're looking at biogeography on multiple time scales, asking where things are, why they're there, how did they get there, and what might be influencing them. So to begin, we'll go ahead and take a look at our lovely, dark, dank, green, beautiful temperate rainforests. And for those of you that aren't aware, temperate rainforests grow throughout the world. They're on all the continents except for Antarctica, and they're typically growing in oceanic environments or environments that are with a Mediterranean climate that are very cool in the summertime. There is no real climactic definition of a temperate rainforest. And I've been lucky to visit a few of these. So here is a Russian temperate rainforest in Primorsky Krai in the Russian Far East. A lot of moss in the understory, a lot of plants. These areas are also known for fungal diversity. So you see here these mushrooms. Also New Zealand. This is an example of a temperate rainforest in the southern hemisphere. Another trait with temperate rainforests, you can see all of these epiphytic mosses and lichens growing in the overstories of trees. If we move back to our North American temperate rainforest, we can see here it's on the west coast, and it's the largest temperate rainforest, and it's also unique in that it has an interior temperate rainforest that's like not right along the coast as well. And again, if we look at the coastal temperate rainforest, we see another very lush environment. And we have similar environments here in Idaho, Northwest Montana, and British Columbia. And what ties these things together is their species assemblages. So both the coastal and interior temperate rainforest have, they're dominated by these overstory conifers, western red cedar and western hemlock. And we've got very, you should say, almost identical species assemblages in either rainforest. There are some differences. If you go along the coast, the rainforest is much more homogeneous. Especially as you get like right along the coast, it is like a real homogeneous carpet of conifers. Whereas the interior temperate rainforest, you're looking at more this habitat being in very moist drainages or on the north sides of the slope. So we see here along the Selway, on the north-facing slope with all the dense trees, that is temperate rainforest species. On the south-facing side where it's drier, this is drier ponderosa pine habitat. The other thing is the rainforest in the interior is drier. There's a lot of evidence of fire history, and the hydrology of the interior temperate rainforest is primarily snow-dominated as opposed to rain. But we have a bunch of species, over 100 plants, animals, and fungi that call both of these rainforests home and are disjunct between each other. So we have things like our sword fern here. We have plants like our Pacific yew. We also have lichen, like our lungwort. We have animals like this little millipede, mollusks, Coeur d'Alene salamanders, and we got this weird mammal as well. So again, we've got these identical species assemblages on both sides of the Columbia Basin. And yeah, it's very wet on either side, but it's extraordinarily dry between these. So the question is, how do these two identical species assemblages get together, or get separated, I should say? And there's two hypotheses. One is the ancient vicariance hypothesis. The second is a recent dispersal hypothesis. We'll look at the ancient vicariance first. So this just postulates that over 2 million years ago, we had contiguous temperate rainforests from the coast all the way through the interior. And then during the Cascade mountain building event, we had a rain shadow created on the leeward side of the Cascades, which dried out the Columbia Basin and separated these two habitats. Then during glaciation, we had temperate rainforest species retreat to glacial refugia, both on the coast and in the interior. And then after glaciation, these populations in these refugia repopulated their respective habitats. Alternatively, in the ancient vicariance hypothesis, this just surmises that we either never had temperate rainforest species in the interior, or they were wiped out during glaciation, and all of our rainforest friends are a result of dispersal events across the Okanagan mountain range in Washington or the central Oregonian highlands. So the way I wanted to approach this, and the way that the Tank and Sullivan lab has been approaching this, is to look at this through the lens of comparative phylogeography. So if we're constructing phylogenies and we find that the ancient vicariance hypothesis is supported, as we see here on the left, we would expect monophyletic clades of only Cascade individuals and only interior individuals. However, if we have a recent dispersal event, we would expect that clade of the southern Cascades would be sister to everything in the north and in the northern Rockies. And then if they went over the Oregonian highlands, we would have the opposite relationship. And work by my lab group, dating back about 20 years, has shown support for both hypotheses. So this Scaphus trurii in Montanus, this is an example of an ancient vicariant species. In fact, they're so diverged that as the result of this research, they were split up into two species between the coast and the interior. However, we got this recent disperser, Haplotrema vancouverense. This is effectively something that's recently dispersed from the Cascades into the interior. So effectively what we have is support for both hypotheses depending on the species. And if we go back to those overstory dominants, cedar and hemlock, what we see is a genomic evidence for rainforest habitat in the interior during glaciation. And this was done by my colleague, Megan Ruffley, prior to me getting here. And so we have this genomic evidence saying, all right, we've got species in the interior, species in the Cascades hanging out during glaciation, but they're going to be at very, very low population levels because if we look at the pollen record, we see that pollen for these species doesn't really start coming into the interior Northwest until about 3,000 years ago. So we've got habitat potentially in both areas. And so I wanted to add to this information and see what else is going on. So I ended up choosing 12 coastal disjunct species, as well as some maritime alpine species that have the same disjunct distribution. And I'm not going to really talk about them too much, but two of these are partridge foot and subalpine larch. And for the subalpine larch, that's my chapter 3. I found that it was a vicariant individual, but I've only got so much time. So two other coastal disjuncts, licorice fern and Pacific yew. I also sampled a lot, but today we're going to be looking at the 3 species: skunk cabbage, devil's club, and wild ginger. And I chose these primarily because they're widely distributed throughout both the interior and the coast, and they're kind of easy to find, but they all have their own idiosyncrasies. So first, skunk cabbage. This is again, a widely distributed species. It's one of the first things to flower. It has these very lovely yellow spathes. The upper right picture I took on Monday, I believe. So they're just starting to come up now. And when they're mature in the growing season, they form these really large flat leaves. You can see Quinn holding up one of those now. And with all these species, you're going to see that the leaves are very broad and very flat. They're trying to get as much light as possible because the overstory forest is shading everything out. This thing is primarily pollinated by beetles and primarily dispersed via water. And this thing almost wasn't sampled because it's not present in these putative glacial refugia in the Clearwater National Forest, which is where my expertise was prior to starting here. I actually, like the week before my field season, I went for a trail run up Moscow Mountain and found this population, and I already knew what skunk cabbage was, so I looked it up and was like, okay, this is a disjunct. It's added on the list. So again, this thing is not present in the putative glacial refugia. So now we'll move to devil's club. Again, we got real large, broad leaves. Most people hiking in the Pacific Northwest aren't huge fans of this thing. I've kind of grown to love it, but it's pollinated by flies and beetles. And its primary disperser is actually bears, but there is evidence that birds are also dispersing this thing. It also has a slightly wider ecological amplitude than my other species, and that it tends to do pretty well in boreal or subboreal regions. So this is a picture of a devil's club stock in south central Alaska, very far away from proper temperate rainforest areas. This is also extraordinarily an important species for First Nations people as well. They use this thing for all sorts of medicinal purposes. And devil's club, unlike the rest of my species, actually has a population outside the Pacific Northwest. There are several populations on the north side of Lake Superior. And one question is, given these things are really small populations, is this a human assisted dispersal recently? And again, like skunk cabbage, this thing is not really present in these putative glacial refugia. It is in one drainage, but it's absent from the rest. And given that both skunk cabbage and devil's club have a pretty easy, or I should say they have the longest dispersal range of all 3 of these species, my prediction was that these are recent migrants into the interior from the coast. So then our final species, Asarum caudatum. Sorry you guys can't see it. Produces this very beautiful purple flower. Again, it's got broad leaves. This thing pollinates itself exclusively. So this is an example here. And then its seeds have these things on them called the lyosomes, which are basically antitractants. They're effectively anti-crack. They've done experiments with these things. The ants, like in 5 minutes to an hour, just take all these things back to their colony. They love it. It's great for them. And then, unlike the other two species, this is very widespread in the putative glacial refugia in the Clearwater National Forest. So given that ants are dispersing this thing and it's widespread, my initial prediction was that this thing is an ancient vicariant species. So in order to actually grab all of these things, or I should say harvest all my plants, I did a lot of it alone, but I also had some help. Garrett and Nate, they are colleagues of mine from FIRE. They accompanied me on a few sampling expeditions. Garrett actually got some subalpine larch for me in central Montana. Quinn, who we've mentioned before, he's my field tech during the 2019 season, and he's also responsible partially for my sanity and also for helping out and grabbing a lot of plants. Matt Hemingway up in this area, he's going to be responsible for all the specimens you're going to see on the map from Southeast Alaska. This guy on the right here, this is Al Joseph, and he's a friend of mine that I studied with in Finland when I was an undergrad. He's from Lake Superior in Canada, and saw a post of mine on Facebook and said, "Hey, we got Devil's Club here. You want me to get some?" I said, "Yes, please, grab me some." Chelsea also assisted me, and then Lucas and I went on to quite a few sampling activities, and we accidentally climbed Mount Shasta on one of these. So sampling was very fun. We got to have a lot of adventures. I skied to my samples. I ended up taking a boat once, trail ran, backpacked in. It was probably the highlight. And I don't know how I conned Dave into letting me do all this, but I got into some of the most beautiful landscapes in North America. So in addition to having like a really broad sampling scheme, I wanted to really hammer these putative refugia. So one of them, again, is this Clearwater Drainages refugia. And then another is that's been known as the island of Haida Gwaii off of the west coast of British Columbia. And again, I got funding to check this area out, and I'd say that was the highlight of all of my sampling. So what's that look like? I harvested about 600 plants for 12 species. It was about a mile of plants. Sometimes I grabbed them from the road. Other times I grabbed them like after a 10-mile round trip hike. The longest distance I went in was 26 miles to basically see if anything was up this drainage. And I found several new populations. And in total, I found 5 new populations, both of ginger and subalpine plant partridge foot. All right, so to actually look at the genetics of these things, I used the DD-RAD sequencing approach, and that allowed me to make some Bayesian time-calibrated phylogenies, and then also look at some population genetics within my samples. So for time-calibrated phylogenies, the way to read this is effectively we've got time on the x-axis here, and with that time calibration, we can infer that the separation between this blue population and green population of this fictitious species is about 6,000 years. And if we want to take the 2 purple individuals, that would be for about 3,000 years divergence. And so now if we plot this on another fictitious landscape, what this might actually look like, we have these trees distributed here, and we can calculate population statistics like FST, which is the fixation index. So higher FST means more differentiation, lower FST means lower differentiation. So we can assume with, say, this mountain range, it's a much more of a dispersal barrier between the purple and green, whereas the river here might be a less of a dispersal barrier, and that's why there's a lower FST. So what this looks like in real life. This is skunk cabbage, and the colors on the phylogenetic tree correspond to individuals on the map. And what we see immediately is we have a southern population sister to everything else north of it. And this is more or less lining up topologically with the northern dispersal route for a recent disperser. However, if we actually look at the dates of these things, we can see that the data divergence here is like a little over 3 million years for this thing. And then if we actually look at the interior species, or sorry, the interior populations, we see we not only have like a single interior population, but two of them. And the divergent states between these are also very old. With this southern interior purple clade, it's around 2 million years is when this thing has started to diverge. And that's like roughly in line with the ancient Vicariance event in the Cascades. And then again, this is despite this thing like not being present in any of these interior drainages. Another thing of note, between the two interior populations, we have a rather high FST of 0.56. So that's, these things have been separated for a while. And then just also interesting, we have our coastal BC individuals here are more closely related to interior northern BC individuals, as opposed to our insular populations on Haida and Southeast Alaska. And that's, again, an old divergent state. And we also have a pretty high FST of 0.49 between insular populations and continental populations. If we move on to Devil's Club, again, we see a very similar topology. We have individuals in the Cascades being sister to everything up north. And this is an old divergent state of around 2 million years. If we move a little further north, we have the North Fork of the Clearwater. So this is one of these putative glacial refugia, and we see all the individuals in the North Fork form a monophyletic clade, and this is supposedly separated around 1.5 million years ago. And moving north, we have a very undifferentiated clade of everything to the north. It's there's a lot of low support values for these relationships. I have things kind of geographically clustering, but I also have things in Montana clustering with things in Alaska. So a lot of low support. And again, it's pretty old. The exception to low supported clades are the Lake Superior population and a population in South Central Alaska. Here I have high nodal support for these relationships, and these are right around 0.5 million years diverged. My lowest heterozygosities on these things are in these three clades. They're around 4 to 6, or sorry, 4 to 6% heterozygosity, which is pretty low genetic differentiation. And then the FST for the highest FST in this species is between the North Fork population and the northern clade, and that's 0.23. So this is evidence that this is also an ancient Vicariance population that's been isolated for quite some time. Let's go with that. All right, and then also the another high FST is between the Lake Superior population and everything else. So looking at this Lake Superior population, based on the divergent states we have, the low heterozygosity, and a pretty high FST, we can kind of rule out human dispersal into Lake Superior for this population. And then if we go to wild ginger, here we have the same relationship. Again, a southern population, sister to everything else. But if we look at the divergent state of this thing, we have a divergent state of 13,000 years. So this is very likely a very recent disperser. And if we look at all of our individuals hanging out in this putative glacial refugia for like in the upper Selway and salmon, what we have is extraordinarily low heterozygosities, like below 1% heterozygosity. And these things are also the most diverged individuals. So rather than being the glacial refuge and everything to the north of it, being descendants of it, these populations in the salmon and upper Selway are actually the leading edge of migration southward rather than being derived from glacial refugia. And again, like the other species, we see that the northern interior individual has closer affinities to the BC coast than it does with the other interior populations. So to sum it all up, we have skunk cabbage and Devil's Club appear to have an ancient Vicariance in the southern interior populations. And we also have evidence of glacial refugia potentially much further north than we had surmised. And then western wild ginger, we have a pretty good indication that this is a recent disperser across the Okanagan Mountain Range within the last glacial maximum. And looking at the topology of all of these things, they're very similar to the northern dispersal route, but they have separated interior populations. And what's kind of interesting is all these guys, even though they're moving at different time periods, like on the order of like orders of millions of years, these things are taking the same migration routes. They're going up the Cascades, crossing over somewhere in central BC, and also crossing over the Okanagan. So that's kind of neat. So this is the first part of my dissertation, looking at historical drivers of biogeography, and that was really tied to glacial cycles. And as we probably all know, the glaciers are kind of, they're moving away, and something else is kind of becoming a little more prevalent in these ecosystems, and that's fire. So we're going to transition into the fire part of my dissertation. And this, again, I started working started working in fire and thinking about fire adaptations when I was an undergrad. And temperate rainforest species, for the most part, are not, they really would prefer fire is not a thing. But there are plenty of other conifers with fire adaptations, which I'm defining as specific physical structures or life histories that aid the plant in either reproduction or surviving a fire event. And these are tied to specific fire regimes. So I'm going to transition and start talking about our fire regimes. And fire regimes have two major components. The first is intensity and also return interval, how often the fire comes on the landscape. And here we have two extremes of fire regimes and fire intensities. We have low intensity surface fires. So this is a fire that's not getting up in the ground, it's hanging out in the understory, not doing a lot of energy release, whereas a high intensity fire that's getting up in the grounds, high intensity release, lots of soil scorch, etc. Now, depending on your suite of fire adaptations, either scenario can mean game over, I'm dead, or either scenario can mean, hey, I'm fine, things are going to be great for either me or my kids. So moving into there are 4 fire adaptations in conifers, and we'll go through the low intensity fire adaptations first. The first is thick bark. This is basically where the tree gets older, it puts on thicker and thicker layers of bark, and that insulates the cambium from a low intensity fire event. Often what you'll see on these landscapes is that on the uphill side, like a lot of needles and stuff will collect, and the fire will be intense enough that it'll actually kill the uphill side of the tree, but because it's not girdled, it'll be able to heal over that. And that's called a cat face fire scar on this incense here. And what we see ideally is a very open park-like stand structure like we see here outside of Lincoln, Montana. These ponderosa pine, if a fire runs through here, it's not going to get in the grounds. Everything's pretty happy. If we look at the second low-intensity fire adaptation, this is unique to pine trees. This is the grass stage. And in this scenario, basically, the pine, when it germinates, it hangs out in this little grass-like tuft. And it'll hang out there for several years until a fire or another stimulus comes through. And if a fire does come through, basically that dense needle clump protects the terminal bud from fire or from getting burned off and killing the tree. So we can see here that thing, it barely got by. So it's going to resprout, or not resprout, but it's going to keep growing and enter what's called the rocket stage. And in this stage, the plant's going to grow meters a year to get that terminal bud above the next flaming front. And then at maturity, all of these species have a thick bark strategy, which again, we have an open park-like stand here in North Carolina, courtesy of the Native Plant Society there. And so it's a very high frequency, very low intensity fire system. So transitioning into higher intensity fire systems, we have serotinous cones. And in this scenario, where the cones at maturity are sealed by resins and heat, either in the form of a lighter, which I did for this lodgepole pine cone at the top, or a crown fire will burn off these resins, and the cones will slowly open up, and the progeny of this species will be able to seed into a very clear ash seedbed. And that basically eliminates competition from any other species when these things germinate. So if we look at this spot in the Quetico of Ontario, all these snags up top, these were killed by a fire probably 20 years ago before I took this photo. And all these little baby trees are the progeny of these jack pine that are dead. And so they don't have any competition from other species. They are competing with each other for sunlight, however. And then if you don't really care about your kids and want to save yourself, you can resprout, which seems like the easiest adaptation for me. This is where a flaming front will go by, consume all the foliage, and then these things are able to resprout from epicormic buds, either beneath the root collar or on epicormic buds within the bark. So my first chapter just got published this year, and this was looking at the phylogenetic distribution and evolution of fire adaptations. This is actually, the genesis of this I actually have in my undergrad at the University of Montana under Dr. Andrew Larson. This is a class project that blew up, and I used that data for another class project that really blew up and became one of my chapters. And again, I'm interested in when these traits evolved, how they're distributed through the tree, the conifer phylogeny, and also looking at diversification rates. So in a lot of other plant lineages, we see that plants that have a lot of fire adaptations or are associated with fire-prone environments have increased rates of diversification. So seeing if that's the same with conifers. So again, I'm using another phylogeny. This time it was built for me. This is from Leslie et al. In 2018. And this is a phylogeny of like 578 species. And we're encompassing all of our conifers here. So we've got Pinaceae, this is our pines, firs, spruces, Douglas firs, most widespread species, most speciose of the families. Another family we have is our Cariaceae. Most of you have probably only encountered this as the Norfolk Island pine potted plant. And then we have a predominantly southern hemisphere conifer family, Podocarpaceae. If you guys haven't been to the southern hemisphere, chances are you've interacted with this thing by watching Lord of the Rings films. And then for Taxaceae, these are Pacific yews and Torias. And for Cupressaceae, the bottom family, this encompasses our things that we call cedars here in North America, as well as things like junipers. And then just to give you a time frame of how this tree is set up, the earliest divergence date on my other species was the skunk cabbage. That was right around 3 million years ago. 3 million years ago is about this line here. So we're looking at a much longer time frame. This line is right around the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. That's the end of the dinosaurs. And here's the Triassic, which is the beginning of the dinosaurs. So very, very old relationships in this family, or this order. So one thing I was looking at was whether something has high diversification rates or low diversification rates. And just to give you guys conceptually what that looks like, something with a high diversification rate, a clade, I should say, with a high diversification rate, is going to be on this recently evolving branch and have lots and lots of species, whereas something with a low diversification rate is going to be much more, it's going to be a lot older of a clade, and we're going to have far fewer species on it. And I was also looking at when did these fire adaptations evolve, so I can use comparative methods to statistically test based on the trait state at the tip of the tree, like what does the common ancestor have as far as traits. So I went through all 578 species and looked through the literature, found what fire adaptations they have, if they don't have fire adaptations. I also classified the climactic zones of all of these species as well. So for my results, we've got around 20% of conifers worldwide have some kind of fire adaptation, and we see multiple convergent evolutionary events for these things. So I'm only going to go through two of the traits. The one here is thick bark. And so how you want to read this is everything that's got red here, that has the thick bark adaptation. Everything with the blue does not. And then if you follow the red back, we can construct what the ancestor of this thing looked like. And the screen here for everyone in the room, the coloration is a little weird, but we estimate that the common ancestor of the hard pine subgenus has thick bark evolving right around the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary. So that's one evolutionary event. But we see that we have multiple convergent evolutionary events for all these other things in 4 of the 5 families. And then if we look at something like the thick bark, if we look at something like the grass stage strategy, we see that this thing has evolved also multiple times, like probably 3 times in total. And this is really interesting because we would have expected, given this trait is extremely complex, it would have been a single evolutionary event. However, again, we see that there's been at least 3 evolutionary events quite recently. And then for the climate correlations, what I found was climates that have a marked dry season are highly correlated with prevalence of fire adaptations. So not deserts where you don't have any growth, and not areas that are too cold. It's something where you have a lot of, like, a really nice growing season, and then it dries out and the foliage is able to burn. So one of the climates that was correlated with all of these traits was the Mediterranean climate, and this is the climate spread throughout North America, Europe, and also like Western Australia and a few other spots. So, but the prevalence of fire traits or being fire adapted does not really contribute towards increased rates of diversification. What is a better indicator of that is whether you're adapted to cold, dry environments, or warmer, wetter environments. And this is really brought on by the end of the mid-Miocene climactic optimum. So during the mid-Miocene climactic optimum, we actually had more widespread temperate rainforests or other wet environments. And afterwards, things started drying out and became a lot cooler. So a lot of the conifers adapted to this system, we see lots of extinction, whereas, things that are adapted to drier climates are doing a lot better. And this is irrespective of whether the thing has a fire trait. So the two lineages with the highest rates of diversification are both that Pinus subgenus Pinus, which we saw was very fire adapted. It also includes junipers, which are by and large not very fire adapted, but they both share the ability to exploit this new niche that came on after the mid-Miocene climactic optimum. So that was kind of looking at broad fire traits throughout the conifer phylogeny. And then as a result of another class project that blew up, I was interested in looking at the geographic distribution of fire traits. And for this, I looked exclusively at North America. And I was interested to see, are these traits randomly distributed across the landscape? Also, does like the phylogenetic composition of these communities influence the traits? And then are there any like really particularly fire-prone regions in North America? And so I needed to divide North America up into regions. I needed to map these traits on the landscape and then do some community phylogeographic calculations. And then my colleague Aaron at the back of the room incorporated some MODIS data to see if there's any mechanistic things behind where we see fire adaptations. So dividing these conifer regions up, this really involved me looking at Little's 1971 tree atlas for the last 20 years and seeing similar shapes. I don't know what that says about my brain, but you can see that we have repeated shared distribution. So these are all 3 different species, and they're occupying roughly the same regions. And this is a lot of species they have different habitat requirements, but they're occupying the same mountainous environments, usually stratified by elevation. So I divided the entire continent up, as you see here. And one interesting thing I also noticed is that we have this horseshoe-shaped distribution wherein species that are shared between regions, but they're not being shared across the Great Plains, which is interesting, especially because this dispersal barrier has probably been present since the Miocene. So the Rocky Mountains are creating a rain shadow. We also have deep soils, and conifers aren't doing very well to cross this Berlin Wall here of the Great Plains. And then looking at our community phylogeographic analyses, I was interested in, are these communities phylogenetically over-dispersed or clustered? What this basically means, if something's over-dispersed, we've got a lot of taxa that are more anciently diverged, not that closely related. occupying these regions, whereas a region that would be phylogenetically clustered, you're going to see a lot of more recently evolved taxa that are more closely related to each other. And in a community, if we're looking at this through traits, a community that's more over dispersed, we're going to expect a lot of convergent evolution, whereas a community that's phylogenetically clustered, we're going to expect a lot of like single evolutionary events. So for our results, first map I'm showing here is just the straight species richness or conifer species per region. And we see that there is kind of a north-south trend. We've got fewer species hanging out in the boreal, and that number grows as we move further south. So now this is the number of species per region with a fire adaptation. And again, we see kind of this north-south gradient as well. If we take, so then remember that globally, we've got 20% of conifers have some kind of fire adaptation, but that is not randomly distributed. If we look at the percent composition of conifers with a fire adaptation in any given region, we see that in California, in Mexico, and then in the Gulf Coast, over 50% of species have a fire adaptation, which is really interesting. And then if we look at the traits themselves, we see also another geographic distribution. So up in the boreal, we only have serotiny. As we move further south, thick bark comes on the scene. Moving further south, we have resprouting. And then when we get into the tropical and subtropical environments of Mexico and the Gulf Coast, we see that grass stage coming into play. So we have three like major regions where over 50% of the species in these regions have fire adaptations, and they're all a little different. So if we look at California, we have a Mediterranean climate. We've got a lot of older lineages, and it's phylogenetically overdispersed, and we see a lot of convergent evolution. And California is really interesting because we have species that are in genera there that they're fire adapted, but the rest of their compatriots, either in East Asia or Europe, they're not fire adapted. So California is kind of this weird spot where things that were otherwise not fire adapted across the globe are evolving these fire adaptations. The Mediterranean California does not have the grass stage as well. If we move to the Mexican regions, Mexico is phylogenetically clustered, and this is because we have like a huge amount of pine species there. Like Mexico, if you guys aren't aware, is the like pine diversity hotspot in the globe. And again, we have a different climate than California. It's subtropical or tropical, and the pines here also display the grass stage. And if we look at the Gulf Coast, this is like a really species poor region, but again, we still have a lot of fire adaptations, and this area also has the grass stage. So yeah, all of these are very different. And if we compare, say, California, where we don't have the grass stage, we can see, sorry, let me back up and explain this slide. So this is MODIS data that is basically satellite data looking at FRP, which is just like a proxy for fire intensity. So higher values are higher fire intensities. And then CV is proxy for fire frequency. And we see where the grass stage is hanging out. We have very low intensity fires with very high frequency. And that's in comparison to this California area here, where it's a lot lower of fire frequency and a lot higher intensity. So we see there is a mechanistic, at least with the grass stage, we see there is a mechanistic basis behind where this thing is growing. And what we can say from this research, these adaptations are not random. They are, they're distributed very widely across, these adaptations are not random. They're latitudinally stratified, and climate is basically influencing where these things grow. And it doesn't matter the phylogenetic composition. If the environment requires it, these things are going to evolve adaptations. However, everything's heterogeneous. So we got 50% of our species in these things with a fire adaptation. That means that 50% don't. And here's an example of a species in Mexico that doesn't have any fire adaptations. This is Abies religiosa, religious fir, up in the highlands of Michoacan, Mexico. And this is where all of our monarch butterflies roost during the winter. I've been here, and this thing could get taken out by a single fire event in a day. And what we're seeing, and this shouldn't be news to any of you, but we're seeing all of our fire adapted ecosystems, non-fire adapted ecosystems, everything's getting pretty out of whack. And I did have some long, I don't know, thing tying everything together where, we do have increasing fire in the temperate rainforests, but I'm kind of running out of time, I believe. So effectively, I really encourage you guys all to like if you want to thank me, call your representatives and everything. Because we're on the precipice of doing some really dumb things, and these ecosystems have been out of whack for the last 70 to 100 years due to proactive fire management or other pressures. So with that, I would like to thank my committee members and funders and my co-authors who really helped me out. I want to thank all these people. You guys helped me out, and the rest of all of you. I just want to go back. Lucas and Ty were great mentors, and the rest of you helped me out. With that, that map that you saw earlier with all my sampling, that doesn't happen without a lot of help. And is there everybody that helped me? And I get emotional, so crazy.
Very well done, Dan.
Questions for Dan?
Yeah, Kai.
So for the first chapter, the first half of the talk,
Yes.
the three species that you looked at is generally supporting the the recent jump of population, right?
Not quite. So they're following that topology, but two of them definitely have like an ancient vicariance history, whereas that ginger is definitely a recent disperser.
So then the fact that there's even one species that supports the old transfer, doesn't that suggest that there was a forest, inland forest already?
Yeah, at low populations, that was part of that previous study where they were looking at the cedar hemlock forest. So we got genomic evidence of it, and we've got evidence with these species as well. But like in the palynological record, it's like it doesn't exist. So these are going to be in like tiny populations. So, and then it depends on the species. So some of them were present, some of them have not been. So yeah, it's a big mix, and that's kind of cool. We have the same species assemblages, but different ways of getting there in different time periods. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm curious if your questions about the ancient variants have brought you even further back in time to think about like some of the research that theorizes about the Eastern Asian, Eastern North American forest junctions, and some of these lineages, like thinking about the Devil's Club with the ginseng that's found in both of these places. And I'm curious, how thinking even further back has shaped your thinking about what you're finding.
Yeah, I've thought about it a little bit. I don't have very well formed thoughts, but going back to some of that, to actually root the trees, you use a closely related species as an outgroup. So both the Devil's Club and skunk cabbage, my outgroup was the East Asian species, and those divergent states are, I think it was 4 million years for the skunk cabbage, and then for the Devil's Club about 7.8. So there's been some kind of connection. I've thought about it, but I don't have enough of formulated idea to give you anything else. Yeah. Yes.
Dan, you got these species that show evidence of the recent dispersal hypothesis, and those that don't? Is there any association with their dispersal mechanisms that
I don't know yet. I'm thinking about it. I think it's weird because again, the skunk cabbage, I think because it's primarily dispersed by water, I think that's why of all those three, you see the deepest divergences, and I also have like the highest support for all the nodes. And I wonder if that's like literally it's just being dendritic and naturally forming like these bifurcating relationships, whereas like Devil's Club, bears and birds are dispersing that thing, it's all over. But I don't know which dispersal method is going to be supporting either or yet, but I am thinking about it. And again, like the ants, I was like, yeah, there's no way this thing made it across the Okanagan, but it apparently did. So, yeah.
I don't know if you can see Zoom or if there's anything
yeah.
online.
Let's see here. I got the chat. Let's see here. No questions on Zoom yet. Any questions on Zoom?
I'll fire one, Dan.
There we go.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, with ginger migrating so recently from ants, I mean, 13,000 years for ants to disperse from the coast all the way inland. Do you think we're missing some other mode of dispersion for ginger, or how do you think it migrated so quickly?
Well, yeah, that's how it migrated so quickly. I don't know, but I think based on, I have a hunch that the Okanagan was a little wetter at one point. And the other thing, like, I don't know if you remember, occasionally we find ginger in spots that like are just super wet, but like there's none of the overstory conifers. So I wonder if there was enough habitat for that thing to make it over the Okanagan pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, just dispersed by ants. Yeah, it's really surprising.
It is. It's a total head scratcher.
Yeah.
Part two is we see a lot of the grass adapted fire adaptation stage in the southern areas, kind of in Mexico and in the southeast. Do you think there's any anthropogenic forces because of the rich history of people being there that might have kind of influenced that grass adaptation for low intensity, high frequency fires? Or do you think there could have been any anthropogenic force to drive that genetic adaptation?
Yeah, I don't think the initial adaptation was anthropogenic, but I'm almost positive that it's reinforced by anthropogenic burning. The dates on them are too early for that, but definitely, yeah. I mean, as you know, like in Western North America, First Nations people were keeping these stands open and so forth with frequent fires.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Great job.
Thanks.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I just have one more little thing. It's kind of a tradition for me to give a book off of my shelf to some of my students. There's only one other person really that I can think of that has a history in the Palouse region that has the type of knowledge of this area that Dan does. Sorry, I get emotional too. And that's Rex Daubenmeier. He was a professor at the University of Idaho first, and then at Washington State University, but also taught at the University of Wyoming too. And so has this history that connects us all together. And so this is his plant geography book with special reference to North America. And so I want to make sure that gets on your shelf.
Yes.
Okay, so the committee should stay here. We could take a break. But everybody else, thanks for coming.